All right, everybody, we are Masechet Eruvin, Daf Dalid. We'll start in Daf Gimel on the bottom. We're discussing the size of an amma. Amma, an arm length, has two definitions, which is a little bit confusing. Why should there be two definitions of an amma? We're going to be talking about amma and the definition, and then we're going to talk about the second half of today is about shiurim, measurements in general and their source. We're going to see that the Talmud is going to say that all of these shiurim, all these measurements are the halakha Moshe Sinai. In other words, they have no source in the Torah. But then we're going to discuss that there are, for some of them, we can actually find sources. So that'll be the second half. But right now, we're going to focus on amma. How long is an amma? One definition says it's 5 handbreadths. Another definition says 6 handbreadths. Why should there be these two definitions? We're going to see a pasuk quoted in a few minutes. Pasuk comes from Yechezkel, where he's describing the dimensions of future Bet HaMikdash. And there's a pasuk that's a little hard to read. It's this one, Ve'ele midot hamizbeach ba'amot. So these are the measurements of the altar in cubits, right, in amot. And then it says amma v'tofach, where each amma is an amma plus a tefach. So an amma equals an amma plus a tefach. Well, mathematically, that's not possible unless there's two different kinds of amma. One amma, which would be 6 tefachim, equals an amma that's 5 tefachim plus another tefach, right? So from this pasuk, you can see that there are two different size amot, and they have different applications. And within the Bet HaMikdash, as we'll see, some things are measured in the shorter amma, some things in the longer amma. And so too in the rest of halakha, we have to figure out which one applies in which case. Okay, so this will be the major pasuk that we use to derive this. All right, yesterday we saw the opinion of Abaye, Mishemed Rav Nachman. So remember these names. This is, Rav Nachman said a statement about shiurim, and there's two versions of what he said. One is by Abaye, another one we'll see in a second is Rava. Abaye said yesterday that regarding sukkah and mavoy, in other words, the maximum height and the width and all of these laws, we use a shorter amma, only 5 tefachim, and that's going to be more stringent. Whereas regarding kilayim, when you want to leave empty space in the field between planting different items, then it's shisha, then it's 6, right? Then we use the bigger one. So that was Abaye's opinion. That's his tradition, what he said in the name of Rav Nachman, that use 5 for some things, 6 for some things, always to be stringent. Okay, so now that we have that, Abaye said that, and we had a long discussion regarding in that regard. Now we can start with our daf. V'Rava mishemed Rav Nachman amar kol amot ba'amma bat shisha ella halalu sochakot v'halalu asebot. So Rava says, also in the name of Rav Nachman, but a different tradition. He says, no, everywhere throughout all the halachot, it's always the 6 amma, right? Always six tefachim in each amma, bat shisha. But he still agrees that there are different sizes depending on sochakot or asebot. Sochakot means where what is a tefach? What is a handbreadth? One is where the fingers are spread apart slightly, like this, and the other one is when they're very tight. And so if you make them very tight, it's going to be a little bit smaller. If you hold the fingers loosely, then each tefach will be a little bit bigger. Why are they called sochakot and asebot? Happy and sad. Well, I guess when someone's happy, when they're laughing, then their mouth is open, they're smiling. So if your hands are loose, that's called sochakot. Whereas when someone is sad, then his mouth is closed. So that's like the fingers being tightly closed. And so that's the difference between them. Okay, so that's Rav Nachman. There is some difference between a little bit bigger and a little bit smaller, but only a much smaller difference. Okay, now with that we have Abaye and Rava, these two opinions. We're going to challenge the first one, Abaye. Metibe, Kol amot she'ameru chachamim ba'amma bat shisha. Sorry. Kol amot shemru chamim ba'ama bat shisha. Says everywhere. This is a baraita that says everything that Chazal says always 6. See, that follows Rava. This is going to be a challenge to Abaye. Ubilbad shelo yehu mechuvanot. As long as it's not precise. In other words, sometimes it's a little bigger, sometimes a little smaller. That's exactly bishlam al Rava. That's exactly what it said. Sometimes a little bit smaller, looser, and tighter. Or for Abaye, that says this means sometimes it's 5 and sometimes 6 tefachim big. This baraita does not fit. So how is he going to answer that? Amar lach Abaye, ema amat kilayim be'ama bat shisha. Abaye says, I'm going to reword this baraita. I know it said kol amot shamru chachamim, but change those words. I'm going to read it as not kol amot, but rather the amot for kilayim are 6. All right. Well, that's a big change to the baraita. So, all right. But okay. So that's, maybe he thinks that's that's his tradition. But hold on, the Gemara rejects this. That can't be the version of the baraita how it reads, because the baraita has a continuation. Shimon ben Gamliel omer. The continuation of that baraita has a minority opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, and he says every time the rabbi said a cubit and amma, it's always regarding kilayim, it's always 6, but not the tight 6. It has to be a looser 6 for kilayim. That's going to be more stringent. So here you go. Here he says explicitly kilayim. So if the Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is talking about kilayim specifically, then the first opinion, it must be talking about all different halachot, right? Not just kilayim, because that's Rabban Gamliel saying something specific about kilayim. So therefore, Abaye's reinterpretation or rewording here really doesn't fit the context. So that's the second challenge to Abaye. Abaye says, okay, you're right. I can't reword the beginning of the baraita, but now that you told me the end of it, oh, look, there's someone that agrees with me. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says that kilayim is 6, and that's what I think also. So ana damri ki Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Right. So according to this reading, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is arguing. And he says 6, and other things 5. And so Abaye can follow that. All right, good. So we solved the problem for Abaye. I mean, it's not a total solution because he still has to follow our minority opinion, but at least he has some opinion to follow. So according to Abaye, certainly there's a machloket here between Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and Tanakama. But how about for Rava? Does Rava have to read this baraita also, that they're in argument with each other? Amalach Rava, rather he could say, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel ha'atalashmoinan amat kilayim lo yasamsem. Right, really the only new thing, since the Tanakama already said that all the amot, and that the rabbi said has to be 6 tefachim big, but not mechuvanot. In other words, sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller. And then the Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says regarding kilayim, regarding the mixing diverse seeds, that one has to be not mitzum samot. That one has to be the bigger one. So in other words, it looks like he's simply explaining when is it smaller, when is it bigger. Regarding kilayim, he used the bigger one. So he's not necessarily arguing, he's rather adding an explanation to the first opinion. And so that would be a way to interpret the baraita, that they're all agreeing. Mat kilayim lo yasamsem. Velema amat kilayim lo yasamsem. Hold on, that doesn't fit the reading either, because if you look at his words, it says those words are not necessary, because in that he agrees with Tanakama. The only thing he's adding is he's explaining those 6 have to not be misum samot. Why do you need this kol amot shamru chamim? Those words are not don't fit here if they're in agreement. Right? Because everybody said everything is 6. So what is that coming to exclude? Oh, so it seems that Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is saying kilayim is 6, but not other things. What not other things? What other things are not 6? Sukkah and mavoy. And now we're back to the way Abaye read this, right? And this Abaye that said for Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, that kilayim is 6, but sukkah and mavoi are only 5. And so then now we're back to saying that this is a machloket, and what we'd have at this point would be that Rava follows Tana Kama, Abaye follows Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, which is possible. But you know what? I think we'd rather that Rava can have all opinions on his side. So that's what we're going to try to do. So we say, Lo, leme'ut amma yesod ve'amma sober. No, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel actually agrees that all the halachot, Kilayim, Sukkah, Mavoi, we use 6 tefach amma. We use the bigger amma. And when he said the word Kilayim here, and this one is 6, he meant to exclude the Mizbeach, the altar measurements in the Bet HaMikdash. And now we get to the pasuk that I showed you when we started. Tichtib from Yechezkel. Ve'ele midot Mizbeach ba'amot, amma betefach. V'chek amma, so every amma is an amma plus a tefach. So in other words, there's 2 sizes of amot. And the base of this, right over here, is going to be 1 amma by 1 amma. We'll see what size. And also the border around it and the higher part. So what are all these things referring to in this pasuk? The first thing is talking about that bottom layer, the foundation. And then there's an upper part, and the horns on top, right? You see there's 4 horns in the corners, and those are a certain measurement. This teaches you that the other altar, there's 2 altars. This one is for animal sacrifices. There's another one inside that was for incense. And that one also is that measurement. To make this easier, I'll show you a picture. Okay, so here, what you can see here is here's the construction of the Mizbeach, the altar for animal sacrifices, that's outdoors. And so you see that this measurement is going to be only 5 tefachim. It's an amma, but the shorter amma. But when it goes in this way, this is the longer one of 6 tefachim. And then when you're measuring up here, it's the longer 6 tefachim, but the horizontal, again, is the shorter one of 5 tefachim. And also the horn on top is 5 tefachim. So so that's what we learn from this, that sometimes it's 5 and sometimes it's 6. And okay, so that's interesting, and that seems to be the source of why sometimes it's 5 and sometimes it's 6 is from this very pasuk. So anyway, back to us in this baraita, when Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, kilayim has to be 6, he meant to exclude, but not the mizbeach, where some of those things are 5. Okay, good. So that concludes the discussion of how big an amma is. Is it 5? Is it 6? And so it's machloket between Abaye and Rava. Halacha is always like Rava, except in 6 items where halacha is ka'abaye. So in this case, so halacha would be like Rava, and that's why for really all halachot that that we use that are in practice for us, we use a 6 tefach amma. Right, so then that's the typical thing. Each tefach is about 3 inches, and so therefore an amma times 6, that's 18 inches. Obviously, there's a lot of different shitot about it, but this is an average one that we often use. Okay, so that's good to know, and certainly very practical. Okay, now we get to a very interesting Gemara. This is actually, quoted in lots of places, and so very early foundational Gemara about Shiurim. Amar Rabbi Chiya bar Asher Amar Rav, Shiurim, Chatzitzin, Mechitzin, Halacha l'Moshe Mesinai. All throughout, almost every halacha that you learn, there's some measurement. There's a minimum amount that you can eat on Yom Kippur, right? And in order to violate Yom Kippur, it's very important, very practical, because if someone is sick, all right, they're not so sick, and they can get by with drinking a little or eating a little on Yom Kippur, then we tell them just drink a little, and then they still fulfilled the fast midoraita, right? And that's because of this, that there's a minimal amount, that less than that, midoraita, it's okay. Only more than that, is there a punishment? So all the shiurim throughout all the halachot, there's no source for it in the Torah. We know it only from halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Also, chatzitzin. What is considered a partition. When you're going to go to the mikveh, wash your hands, you have to make sure there's no separation between the water and your skin. And so all of the laws about that are also not found in the Torah, but are based on tradition. And mechitzot, in other words, the height of boundary markers regarding all kinds of halachot like kilayim and Shabbat, Eruvin, and things like that. All these are based on tradition. Okay, so that's a very important statement in the name of Rav, but we're going to challenge it. It's maybe kind of seems strange that such a foundational thing has no source, and if we look carefully, we'll see that there actually are sources for some of these things. Let's see what the sources are, and we'll test them out. Okay, shiurin, is that true? Deoraitahu, what do you mean? It's right there in the Torah. Dichtib, eres fritaus ora, right? Eres zet shemen udmash. So the pasuk talks about all the different fruits and grains that Israel is blessed with. Now, obviously, the Peshat, this pasuk is just telling us how wonderful the land is that it produces all these nice fruits. But the rabbis learn midrash from this. Rav Hanan, this is not just a pasuk that's just poetry praising the land. Rather, this is encoding halachot. Every item mentioned in here is based on telling us a shiur for something. Chayta, a grain of wheat. הנכנס לבית המנוגה, וכליו על כתפיו, וסנדליו וטבעותיו בידיו, הוא והם טמאים מיד. היה לבוש כליו וסנדליו ברגליו, וטבעותיו באצבעותיו, הוא טמא מיד, והן תורין עד שיהיה בכדי אכילת פרס. Okay, so this is a little bit slightly complicated halacha. I'll explain it to halacha, then I'll tell you what it has to do with wheat. If you go into a house that has leprosy, there's mold on the house, the Kohen comes and says, this is sarat, then everything in the house becomes tameh. But there are two levels of tum'ah. We know this from pasuk in Vayikra, which I'll show you right here. Haba el habayit kol yemei hiskiro oto yitmadar. Someone who comes into the house, he becomes tameh. It's a light amount of tum'ah until that evening. However, that's just if he comes into the house, which means even for a second. However, someone who sleeps in the house, and someone who eats in the house, that person gets a higher level of tum'ah and has to wash his clothes. So you see that walking into a house is a shorter time, right? Even just a second in the house, and it's a lighter level of tum'ah. But someone who spends more time in the house and sleeps there or eats there, well, how long does it take to eat? You have to actually eat. The rabbis say, no, it's the amount of time that you would have and need to eat a meal. If you stay there that long, then not only you become tameh, but also your clothing becomes tameh, and that's a higher level of tum'ah. So this is the basis of this halacha. Very interesting. These two pasukim back to back. Now we'll go back and see what it says in the Mishnah. Someone who walks into a house that has sarat, and if let's say he's holding some clothing, right? He has it on his shoulder, or he's holding his shoes, or he's holding his rings, he's holding in his hand. So since he's holding in his hand, it's just an item, it's an object. So as soon as he walks in 1 second, he and all the things he's holding become tameh, the lower level of tum'ah. However, if he was wearing his clothing and wearing his shoes and wearing his rings, then he becomes tameh immediately, because that's the first pasuk. But the other items that he's wearing are only accessories to himself, and so they don't become tameh right away. They only become tameh if he stays in the house long enough to eat a meal. Okay, that's what the halacha is about. Now, how it applies to us. What's the amount of time it takes to eat a meal? Oh, well, to eat a piras. A piras is a loaf of bread, about 4 egg sizes worth of bread. And what kind of bread? Pat chitin, velo bat seorin, eseh ve'ochel beliftan. It's bread made out of wheat, which is easier to eat than bread made out of barley. That means if you're sitting and sitting down for a meal and you're eating it with some dip, which also makes it easier to eat. So it's easier to eat one with the dip as you're like reclining and concentrating on that. So in other words, it's a relatively short amount of time. This is a very important amount of time, you know, and lots of halachot, like when you're eating masa at the seder, right? Also, you have to eat a kizayit within this amount of time. How long is this amount of time? Some say 2 minutes, 9 minutes is all different amounts, right? But that's the point. That's an amount of time to eat a meal, to eat this amount of bread. Okay, so now we see that chita in the pasuk here. The word chita also applies, by the way, to Yom Kippur, right? If someone needs to eat on Yom Kippur, they can have a little at a time. That they can eat a little within the amount of time it takes to eat a meal, and then they should wait that much longer, you know, every 10 minutes or so. Okay, so the word chita in the pasuk in Devarim is hinting to this halacha that in order to make it for one's clothing that one's wearing to become tameh, one has to stay in the house amount of time it takes to eat a loaf made out of wheat. Okay, good. The other ones are simpler. Seora, how about a barley? What halacha does that apply to? Right, a corpse, if you have a full corpse or even a large amount of a corpse, then it makes something tameh. Anyone who touches it, anyone who carries it, and even if it's in the house, it makes everything in the house, right? It spreads throughout the house. But if it's not a full corpse and not even like the majority of it, just a small piece, what's the smallest piece? A size of a barley grain, right? Less than the size of a barley grain, it's nothing. You can touch it, it doesn't have any tumah. But the size of a barley grain, it makes people tameh if they touch it or if they carry it. Okay, so there you go. That's why it says barley in the pasuk is hinting to this shiur. How about gefen? A nazir is not allowed to drink wine. You can't drink any wine. But how much would he get a punishment for? To that amount of wine. So gefen is a hint to that amount. Te'ena. We saw Masechet Shabbat. Anytime if you carry just a tiny bit, patur. But if you carry a dried fig size of anything that's edible to a human, then that would be chayav. So there you go. Te'ena is a hint to that law. Limon kiditnan. If you have a basket with holes in it, right? If it's still a usable basket, then it can still be mekabel tum'ah. Anything that is utensil has the potential to receive tum'ah. However, if it has holes in it that are so big that you put pomegranates in it and the pomegranates will fall out, that's how big the holes are, then that basket is really not usable for anything. Well, maybe for watermelons, but that's not considered usable. But that's the halachic definition is, once it's big enough for pomegranates to fall through, it's not usable. So there you go. This is a very important shiur. We saw it quoted many times in Masechet Shabbat, and so Limon hints to that. Eres zet shemen udvash. Eres tekol shiureha kazetim. Right. So zet shemen, olives. Olives are all over the place. I mean, this is the most common shiur found. Anything that you're not allowed to, most things that you're not allowed to eat, like not eating pig and things like that, right, is the amount of an olive size. So that's everything. So kol shioreh zetim. This is a land full of olives. It's kind of like appraising the land, not just because it has delicious fruit, but because its fruits remind us of all the halachot that apply to those fruits. It's a nice way of thinking about it. So kol shioreha salka de'atech. What do you mean? What do you mean? All the measurements? Not all the measurements. Not true. We just pointed out a whole bunch of measurements that are not. Some are figs, some are pomegranates. Not everything is a date. Now I didn't mean kol ela ema eres sherov l'shioreha kazetim. I didn't mean kol literally. I meant most of the measurements are like zetim. Obviously, it probably went the other way around, that the halacha has so many laws regarding with zetim because they're so common, right? Okay, but it's a beautiful way of kind of appreciating nature through halacha. Devash, kekote bet hagasa liyom kippurim. So with dates, devash, we say honey, but usually when we say devash, it can mean bee honey, but most of the time in Tanakh, it means date honey. Like haroset, or date syrup. So that's this amount, a date size. That's the amount that you're not allowed to eat on Yom Kippur and Mideoraita. Okay. So now this is the end of the question, right? All that was part of a question, because we saw all the way back that Rav said all measurements are from tradition; they're not in the Torah. And now I just showed you a whole list of things that are in the Torah. Okay, so that's the question. And the Gemara says, hold on, what are you talking about? Are these explicit? This list we just saw, it's not an explicit source, right? I mean, look how much we had to add. Just giving us a bunch of fruits, right? So this is not an actual source. Rather, these are in fact traditions. And this pasuk that you quote is just an asmachta. Right, this is a very important concept. Asmachta, this is just a support. That literally, asmachta means a support. You can think of it the way Rambam does, as a mnemonic device. Right, we know the law from tradition, but we find a pasuk that doesn't really mean that, and we attach it to the pasuk because that way it'll be a mnemonic in the device. Every time we read the pasuk, because everybody knows pasukim well, and you'll say, oh, that's the halacha. We remind ourselves of the halacha based on that pasuk. Other Rishonim say, no, it's more than a mnemonic. It's more like it's actually a support. When you have a law that is merely d'Rabbanan or has no source, it's from tradition, and then people say, well, they might not take it so seriously, and so the rabbis attach it to a pasuk, even though they know that the pasuk doesn't mean that literally in Peshat, but by attaching it to a pasuk, then they can gain some of the authority they can transfer some of the authority of the pasuk to the law, and so that's why asmechinhu they bring it support. Okay, so that's why this is called asmachta, and you find this many times in Shas. Something is called when they say that the pasuk doesn't quite mean that, or really actually more often when they say it's a drabanan, and yet you bring a pasuk, and they say it's an asmachta. So this is a classic example of that. Okay, good. So now we've resolved the problem for shiurim, right? We said at first shiurim, all these measurements are based on tradition from Moshe at Sinai. We challenge that from this pasuk of all the fruits. Isn't this a biblical proof? And we say no, we reject the biblical proof. This pasuk is just a nice praise of the land of Israel, although a nice hint, a poetic hint. Good. Okay, but now we get to the next thing that Rav said, hatzitzin. Those items that are a block between the water and one's skin. What is considered a blockage? What is not considered? These are tradition. So the Talmud asks, what do you mean? Deoraita ninhu. It's right there in the Torah, dichtib, berachas et kol besaro b'mayim, regarding a zav. Right? It says that if a person becomes tameh because of an emission, he goes to the mikveh and he washes all of his flesh with water. So there you go. The water has to contact his flesh. There can't be anything separating the water and his skin, right? Isn't that obvious? Okay, b'mayim b'mei mikveh. So when it says b'mayim, to be learned, that means mei mikveh, not just a shower. Kol besaro, mayim shekol gufo ole bahen. So kol besaro, the word kol says that water has to reach all of one's skin. So in other words, how much water do you need in the bath in order for it to be able to encompass your whole body? This is 1 amah by 1 amah by 3 amot. In other words, 3 cubic amot, the rabbis say will be enough to cover a person's whole body. And the rabbis translate this measurement into a volume measurement of 40 se'ah. Okay, and so this is a very important source because this is the source of how the minimum size the mikveh needs to be. Okay. Good. 40 se'ah. I mean, if you want to try to measure it. Actually, you can do it. You can figure out how much a cubic amah is of water in terms of gallons, and compare that to se'ah. And what you'll find is anywhere between, depending on how you calculate it, anywhere between about 80 and 200 gallons. So anybody who builds a mikveh today was going to use a bigger one, because 80 is kind of small. You have to really scrunch up to fit your whole body in an 80 gallon tub. Okay, that's a very important source for the size of a mikveh. So, so therefore, now we have a question, right? So that's the question. Chasisin, you said that that all this is based on tradition. Here's pasuk. It says explicitly that the water has to touch your skin. Oh, so this is what we meant to say. Of course, the law of a mikveh and the water has to touch your skin. That's in the Torah. But what does the tradition add? That even your hair has to be in the water. Right, and so this is very important to anyone with long hair. When women go in mikveh, have to make sure that their hair isn't floating on top, right, but it goes all the way under. That's the main reason you need someone there to watch. Well, it's a good idea to have someone there to watch to make sure that their hair goes under, right? Even though the hair is not skin, I might have thought maybe it's not included. No, here the tradition, the pasuk doesn't say it, but tradition adds that hair also has to go under. He says if you have one hair that has a tie, that has a knot in it, then that's a chatzitza, because the water can't get into the knot, because that's a tight knot. So even one knot, right, is considered a separation, right? That's why people, when we go to mikveh, to comb our hair, right, brush it so there's no knots in it. If there are three hairs that are knotted together, that's okay, because three hairs is not going to make a very tight knot. It's too thick, and so the water can get in. Two, he's not sure. It's kind of in between. Is that going to be very too tight or not so tight? Okay, so that's what it's coming to add. Now the Gemara rejects that too. It says, even the law that hair has to go into the water, that also is in a pasuk. The Tanya, v'rachaset kol besaro, et hatafel b'saro b'zeu se'ar. As the pasuk has an extra word et, what is that coming to include? Something that is besides subordinate to his flesh. So what is that? Must be hair. And so I know that hair has to go into the water also. So therefore, I know everything from the Torah. What do I know? What do I need the tradition for? Oh, the tradition is actually teaching us something else. The following halacha of Rabbi Yitzchak, which I'll say now in detail. According to the Torah, if you have something on your body that covers a majority of your body, and it's something that you're particular about. In other words, you don't want it there, right? So let's say, you fall in mud and it covering majority of your body, and you don't want it there. So then you go to the mikveh, it's no good because the mud is covering most of your body and you don't want it there. So that's the Torah law. If you don't mind it being there, then it's okay. If it's Dead Sea mud and you want it there because it's good for you and you want to keep it on there all the time, that's not a great example, right? But I don't know, suntan lotion or something, right? Something that you want to be there, then it's not a chatzitza because I like it there. The rabbis came and they made a gezet, two gezerot. They said if it's something that you want there, even if it doesn't cover your whole, if it's something you don't want there, right? If it's mud, it's dirt, and you don't want it there, even if it covers only a small part of your body, it's still considered a chatzitza and you can't go in with it. And also the other way around, if it's something that covers most of your body, even if you want it there, it's also a chatzitza, right? In other words, they took one level and said, although according to Torah, it has to be, for the Torah law, in order to be a chatzitza, it has to cover most of your body and it has to be something you don't want there. But the rabbi said, no, either one is going to make it a chatzitza. But what's excluded from this rabbinic decree? If it covers only a small part of your body and it's something you want there. For example, nail polish, right? That's the classic example. Nail polish, only small amount of your body, and this nice fresh nail polish, not chipped. Then, right, a woman wants it there. So in that case, there's no gezerah. So the Gemara asks, why don't the rabbis make a gezerah on that? And something that is a little part of your body, and you don't mind it being there. Why don't they make a gezerah from that to something that you do care about, that you don't want it to be there? Or make a gezerah of something that's on the small part of your body for something that covers your whole body. No, those themselves are already a fence. We're not going to make a fence on a fence. So therefore, according to Torah, only if you have both factors together, that's chatzitza medoraita. The rabbi said either or is no good, right? But if you have neither of them, and the rabbis don't make a gezerah on that, because that will be a double gezerah, and you don't go two steps. And so because of this, many rabbis say that a woman with good nail polish is allowed to dip in the mikveh. Others disagree because of another reason, that sometimes it can chip, and then something that you don't want to be there, and that would be a problem. Because this is the major source for that whole discussion. Okay, good. So now. Okay, good. So we resolved that problem, the second one, right? So regarding chatzitza, first we said all chatzitza, anything that, this whole law of something that is considered a partition is tradition. Then we said, what do you mean it's not tradition? It's in the pasuk. The guy has to go in the water. The water has to cover his everything. Even says to include hair. So all that's in the pasuk. So rather, you're right, that is doraita. When Rav said this is from tradition, what was he talking about? He was talking about this law here, that something that you want to be there, that you don't want to be there, and that is covers most of the body. That's the thing that is considered a chatzitza, a partition, and you wouldn't have known that from the Torah, and that's what the tradition came to add. Okay, what you're seeing from here is that the Gemara is kind of saying from what we've said at first, the tradition covers all these things. It's no, everything is doraita. The tradition only adds a little item that we didn't know before. Okay, the last item for today, that partitions, right, walls and fences and their sizes. Rav said that's halacha l'Moshe Sinai. The Talmud asks, what do you mean doraita ninhu? It's in the Torah. Damar mor aron tisha bechaporet tefach arekan asara. There's a statement that is quoting from Masechet Sukkah that says the Aron, right? The Aron where the Torah, where the Luchot were kept, the Torah was kept in the Kodesh Kodashim. The Aron is Amma v'chetzi. The Torah says you make it in one Amma and half an Amma. Amma and a half. How much is that? Well, an Amma is 6 tefachim, so half Amma is 3 tefachim. 6 plus 3, that's 9. So the Aron itself is 9 tefachim. On top of the Aron, we have a kaporet, right? It's a golden cover. That's the things that has the kirubim attached to it. The kaporet, that cover itself, is a tefach wide. It doesn't say anywhere in the Torah how big it is, but the rabbis derive that it's a tefach. So the entire assemblage of the Aron, of the ark, plus the cover is 10. And that is considered a domain. This Gemara here does not explain it much, but if you look in the Masechet Sukkah, I have it here, you can see it. Right here it says, "Aron tisha mechaporet tefach arekan asara." All this is said in the name of these 3 rabbis. So he said this is the source of it. And it also says, "V'nodati lecha sham," Hashem will appear to the Nevi'im there at that spot, to Moshe at that spot. And so this is a separation, this is a barrier between the upper realm, right, the realm of Shekhinah, and the human realm, which is below. In other words, it's right on top of the kaporet. That's when God meets the prophet, right? And so therefore, this is the dividing line between the upper and lower realms. And so that's how we learn that a mechitza, something has to be a separation between, something has to be 10 tefachim tall, right, based on this. Okay, this is very interesting. There's a lot more to say about this, but for another time. Maybe on Sukkot we'll talk about it. Okay, so now so mechitzot, we see based on this, is in the Torah. Why just tell me it's from a tradition? Right here in the Torah it says that the Aron is 9 plus 1, that's 10, and that is a domain in and of itself. Last siricha l'Rabbi Yehuda, damar amat binyan ba'ama bat shisha amat kelim ba'ama bat hamisha. Oh, you're right. I would know this, right? However, you know why I need the tradition. I need it for the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda says that the amma in the Bet Hamikdash, amma in the Bet Hamikdash, in the architecture of it, is always the sixth one, the longer one, that 6 handbreadths. However, of the furniture in the Bet Hamikdash, amat kelim, the amma bat hamisha is only 5. And so you see, that's what the tradition has to tell us. Because this, when it says 10, right? Well, 10 what's? 10, it's based on an amma and a half. So if it's based on an amma and a half, and if it's 6 tefachim for an amma, then that 6 plus half is 9. But if it's only 5, then you see it's going to be less. And so I need to know that for the Yehuda, since the Yehuda says that the furniture is only 5, is the shorter amot, then I would only have, right, 5 plus half of that is 7.5, plus 1 on top is 8.5. So in other words, it's a different amount, and I wouldn't know all of the shiurim. So you see, I need the tradition to tell me that a partition is 10 high, because the ark, according to this opinion, is not 10 high, not 10 tefachim high. Will it be me'ir? All right, that's fine according to the Yehuda. But what about according to the Bimeir? Because the Bimeir says all the amot, even the ones in the Bet HaMikdash and even the furniture there, is a regular amma, right? Amma of 6 handbreadths. So in other words, according to him, the Aron is also based on an amma of 6 handbreadths. So an amma and a half is 9, plus 1 is 10. And so I have a source from in the Torah that 10 handbreadths is a typical mechitza. By the way, this is throughout, all halacha. A minimum size of a fence or whatever you want to separate is 10 tefachim. And so we have a source for the Bimeir in the Torah. So why are you telling me that partitions are a tradition from halacha l'Moshe Sinai? Oh, the Bimeir, yatai hilcheta legod ulavud udofen akuma. So the tradition is not actually teaching us that 10 tefachim high is a partition. I know that from the Torah, but rather it's going to teach us these other laws that I would have no idea about them if I only had the Torah. For example, good, that means I extend. If I have a wall that's shorter, I can imagine, let's say it's only 10 tefachim, right? And the schach is way up high, I can imagine as if the wall extends all the way up. So for extending a wall, that's called good. Good asik, good achit, extending it up, extending it down, very important for different halachot. Lavud. Lavud means if I have, let's say I have a wall and there's some space in the wall. If the space is less than 3 handbreadths, it's called lavud. It's like it's not even there. It's just a hole and it's as if it's covered up. That's also important because you might have a window in your sukkah or something like that. That's all lavud. Odofen akuma, we mentioned this yesterday. If I have, let's say an overhang of my house and then the schach starts, so the schach doesn't reach all the way to the wall of the sukkah, right? There's unkosher schach in between, so that's okay because I consider the wall as if it's a crooked wall and it just goes all the way there. And the wall does in fact start and touch the schach, and all those things are kosher. So these things I would have no idea that that these were considered good partitions in the Torah, and therefore the tradition comes to add this. So that's why we have all these traditions. So, okay, that's the end of the discussion. We can continue with the next section tomorrow. Just one point about shiurim is that all of these shiurim are really a tremendous leniency. Because if you didn't know anything about shiurim, you would assume that even one molecule of pig is already assured and punishable. And so by having these minimum amounts, right, actually is a great leniency and is useful in all kinds of ways, like someone who's sick on Yom Kippur. And there's some discussion about how about for a non-Jew? A non-Jew is not allowed to eat, for example, Eruvin min hachai and things like that. Right? Is there a minimum shiur for a non-Jew for the Sheva Mitzvot ben Noach? And it seems not so, right? And so you see from that kind of from in natural law at the the basic logic is that there would be no minimal amount, and if there's no minimal amount, it would really make life very difficult. Even one drop of something we see on chametz when we don't have we have that problem, right? It's so much more difficult to do anything. So this is these are the shiurim, and this is the main source for all of these laws of shiurim that come up everywhere. Baruch Adonai L'olam, Amen v'Amen.